Stein Hall. I'm Mike Gousha. This is On the Issues. Joining me again today is Professor Charles Franklin, who's the director of the Marquette Law School poll, and we are releasing our latest survey this afternoon. We'll be taking about the next 50 or 55 minutes. I think we've got plenty of material, so we'll be using most of that time to walk you through the results and provide some analysis of the numbers. But before we begin, we will do what we always do at the start of these programs, and that is tell you about the sample, when we were in the field, how many people were surveyed, cell phones, etc., etc. Charles, take it away.
Yeah, that was Mike's nice way of noting that my number of slides has been growing and growing and growing.
66 today.
I'm holding out for a 3-hour OTI next time. So we were in the field September 11th through the 14th, last Thursday through Sunday, as usual. We interviewed 800 likely voters and 589, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. 800 registered voters, 589 likely voters. The registered voter sample has a 3.5% margin of error, and the likely voter sample has a 4.1% margin for error. We call cell phones as well as landlines, and about 40% of the sample is cell phone.
Well, let's get right to the governor's race. That's the big race in this fall's election. And Charles, we'll start with looking at the numbers in August among registered and likely voters, and then we'll move to September.
All right. So last time, these were the numbers. A 2-point Burke advantage among likely voters and a 3-point Walker advantage among registered voters. Both of those were inside the margin of error, as our results have been for some time. I'm also going to tell you that this is the last time you will see decimal places in a result. I thought it would clarify things for people, but instead it seems to have created far more trouble and problems than it clarified. So just to let you know, decimal points were used last time. We'll go ahead and round them to whole numbers from now on, because clearly the world demands that. I guess I should have realized that if I were having trouble how to round them, then other people would too. But in any case.
So then September.
And so we have new data, and some things have changed and some remain the same. Well, let me tell you before I put it up, so let me frame it for you. Sorry, but what you're seeing is a shift in enthusiasm and engagement between the parties, and so things move in opposite directions. Let me show you now. So we have among likely registered voters a dead even tie, 46 to 46. And among likely voters, we have Walker with a 3-point advantage, 49-46. So the same old here is this race stays within the margin of error, with a tie among registered and a slight but inside the margin of error advantage for Walker. But what has happened between August and September is that the registered voter number has gone from slightly favoring Walker to a dead tie. It's moved a little bit, actually, in a Democratic direction. While the likely voter model has gone from a 2-point Burke advantage to a 3-point Walker advantage, again, inside the margin of error both times. So what has happened is likely voters, as you'll see in a minute, has seen a real blossoming of Republican excitement, and that has helped Walker among likely voters. Democrats have calmed down a little bit, and that, paradoxically, has actually helped them among registered voters because they're a little less likely to be in the likely category. So we'll say more about that right now. But the main point is, still inside the margin of error, still no evidence now for the 4th poll in a row of a clear front runner. And I think the other thing, as you saw last time, whether we're talking about registered or likely, we see a bit of a difference. And we continue to see a bit of a difference, though this time that difference is a little bit smaller than it was a month ago.
This is the second poll where we've measured voter opinion on the Attorney General's race and the other big race in the statewide ballot. Let's look at the August numbers among both of these groups, Charles, and then the September numbers.
So in August, I'm sorry, this is...
Yeah.
a little hard for me to turn around and see, so I apologize. So in August, Susan Happ had a bit of a lead, 7-point lead over Schemmel among registered. It was about the same among likely, 42-32. I emphasized last time how many people had failed to form an opinion about either of them. That was 82% did not know enough about Susan Happ to have an opinion. 87 didn't know enough about Brad Schemmel. So there was a lot of learning to go. You see that in these changes. So among registered, it's now a dead heat, with Happ at 39, Schemmel at 38. But we still have between undecided and don't know a total of 20% who don't know where they come down on this race. When we move to likely voters, this doesn't make much difference, but now it's Schemmel by 1, 42-41. Obviously, both of these results are well inside the margin of error here as well. And even among likely voters, still a pretty big percentage, 16%, who haven't made up their mind in this race. We'll come back to talk more about how much people are learning about these two candidates later, but there's clearly still a lot of learning going on and a very much more dynamic race.
Let's drill down a bit, Charles, on these likely voters. And let's look at likely voters according to the way they self-identify, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, Independents.
Right. So in August, and as well in July, as a matter of fact, we had seen Democrats a little more enthused, a little more engaged, a little more likely to say they were sure they were going to vote in November. And so in August, the Democrats were a little over 80% certain they would vote. Republicans were about 77%. Independents, as is usually the case, a bit less likely. But when we go to September, that's dramatically reversed. Now it's the Republicans at 80% likely to turn out, likely voters, and Democrats have fallen to just 73% likely to turn out. So a big shift here in just a month. Part of that surely is because of a concerted effort on the GOP side to energize their voters. Governor Walker has pushed hard on the question, on the issue of saying to his supporters, we can't be lackadaisical, we can't take this for granted. That's been pushed in advertising, campaign work, and radio, and so on. The decline among Democratic enthusiasm, I think, is a little harder to understand. I can't think of events that would necessarily lead you to think there would be a drop-off there. And so there is a question about why is there this shift in the sample. On the other hand, in August, a lot of people thought that it was odd to have more likely voters who were Democrats than Republicans. Usually Republicans have a little advantage on that. Here you see that reversed, though rather sharply reversed in just.
We've got a couple numbers too on the enthusiasm issue specifically, Charles. Both in August and September.
So this was certainty of voting. Here is enthusiasm. In August, not much of a difference, but Democrats at 60, Republicans at 58, Independents well behind. When we come to September, the Democrats really haven't moved. They're still at 60 where they were. But Republicans have jumped up to about 68. So there's a substantial movement there among Republicans to become more enthused and also more likely to say they're certain to vote. Again, when I opened this, I said, so think about how we see opposite shifts occurring among registered voters versus among likely voters. Here you see the difference. The likely voter sample in July and August had a Democratic advantage among likely voters. This time we have a Republican advantage among likely voters.
Now let's take a look at the composition of the sample. And one of the things you've done, Charles, is to look at the composition of all of our samples. We've done, I think, 24 polls now since we began the polling project. It is interesting. This sample is a little different than some other samples.
Yeah, and this is something that certainly folks in the political world are going to scrutinize. So let's scrutinize it for everybody. So here is all of our polls, 24 polls now over 3 years. Over all of those polls for registered voters, we typically have 27 Republican, 31 Dem, 38 Independent. And among likely voters, just a little bit more Republican, 29 instead of 27, 1 point more Dem, 32, and independents at 36, falling off a little bit. So that's sort of the typical, but then we see variation of plus or minus 2 or 3 percentage points on these over time. In August, we actually, just by happenstance for the registered voters, happened to be exactly on the long-term average, and the likelies were pretty close. But when we move to this month, you'll see a little tick up in the reps and a little tick down in the Dems. So that this sample has 29 rep, 28 Dems, so it's up 2 for Republicans and down 3 for Democrats, giving a +1 Republican advantage in the registered voter sample. And on the likely side, that enthusiasm I was talking about before produces a noticeable bump up for the Republicans and now a 4-point Republican advantage among likely voters. And this is something that people should look at and be a little skeptical about. It could be that this is just an outlier sample, one that departed a little bit more from our normal results. A shift of 5 points in the party ID net distribution is more than we've typically seen. And for registered voters, it's the first time in 24 polls that we've seen more Republicans than Democrats among registered. And it's 1 point, but it is a point. It's about the 4th time that we've seen more Republican likely voters. And so it's not quite as unusual to see that where enthusiasm can play a role, and enthusiasm can go up and go down for either party. But it's certainly worth noting that we have this shift in the partisanship. Now, so one possibility is outliers happen. Statistically, they should happen 5% of the time. So 1 time in 20, this is our 24th poll. So maybe we're just due. That's possible. But there are a few things you should know about the sample that make that a little less likely. The one is that we see the growth in Republican partisanship occurs across all geographic regions of the state. And our geographic balance of the sample is exactly the same as it's always been. So it's not like we suddenly got way too many calls out of one Republican area and not enough out of the Democratic area. That didn't happen. It's very even. It's also even across most demographic groups. The 18 to 29-year-olds show a particular surge in Republican identification. And that is a group that sometimes fluctuates more than many. So those are the caveats that you should keep in mind in looking at this. I do want to say one thing, because there's a tendency to think that party ID and its balance drives all survey results. So let me just give you a couple of examples. One of those previous times that Republicans were more numerous among likely voters was our first May of 2012 poll. So about 3 weeks before the recall. We had more Republican likely voters than Democrats. Scott Walker led by 6. 2 weeks later, we had more Democrats than Republicans, and Scott Walker led by 7. The actual outcome of the race was 6.8 points. And so both of these quite different, or at least noticeably different party balances, nevertheless produced results within 1 point of the election outcome. So that's not to discount the importance of the party balance, and you should pay attention to it, but it's easy to think that it drives every result. When we go through all the rest of the survey, you're going to see quite a few policy items and opinion items that show no change at all, and some that show a change in the Democratic direction. So just want to lay all that out for you. The last one is the last time that we came in with an unusually shifted sample was almost exactly 2 years ago, when I came in and said for the first time Tammy Baldwin was leading in a race for the Senate. And everybody shook their heads and said, how could that possibly change so much in such a short period of time? And that was the time that showed a Democratic surge. And it did taper off in the subsequent polls. But it's just a point that sometimes the movement is real, sometimes it's not. The problem is you can't know for sure until later. So that's, sorry. I'm striking my host.
I'll survive. We're going to talk about job creation here for a moment. This is something that we pulled on pretty consistently for the last number of polls. This is this issue of whether or not the state is creating jobs at the same rate as other states, whether we're creating a faster pace, or whether we're lagging behind. Why don't we walk our way through those numbers to see where we are this time?
Obviously, a central argument of the year. In the August poll, 48% said we were lagging, 8 said faster, 34 said the same. That was a notable uptick in lagging and downturn in keeping up or the same. And it followed on the heels of some heavy advertising by the Burke campaign. And the poll was in the field just about the time that Governor Walker started his rebuttal ads to that series. So to the extent that you believe in advertising, that was going on. What we see this month is a little bit of a shift. So lagging has come down back to where it was actually in July, 42. Faster and the same together are now at about 50. That's a shade less than it was earlier in the summer, but it's back in that direction. So that's consistent with the notion that give people advertising that makes an argument, and some people will respond to it and accept that message.
Let's break this one down about party too, Charles. We would imagine that Democrats might see things a little bit more negative light. Republicans might see it better. Was that indeed the case? And has it changed?
Oh, it just might be. Yeah. So this is the people that respond, right? So in August, 75% of Democrats said lagging behind, and some very large percentage. If you put these two together, 75% of Republicans said at least keeping up. But this month, it's a little bit more. Democrats are up to 76 lagging. Republicans are up to 81, at least keeping up. Independents, who could be important in this, over there on the right are about evenly divided. But if we look at August, you look at that brown bar over here, and now in September, you can say that independents have moved a little down on the lagging arc. So the jobs number that had been holding in the low to mid 40s early in the year moved in a more lagging direction in August, but has now moved back a bit in September.
In the 2010 campaign, you'll recall Governor Walker promised that the state would create 250,000 new jobs in his first term in office. How important is reaching that number? Republicans say it was more of an aspirational statement. Democrats say it was a promise. How important is it to voters?
And first of all, voters are pretty sure we're not going to get there. 84% say we're not going to get there. 73% of Republicans say we're not going to get there. So getting there is not really much of a debate at this point in our data or elsewhere. But on the important side, 29% say that this is a very important goal, 35 somewhat, 20 not very, 15 not at all. Look at the difference across party, and let's just look at the various, the thing to pay attention to. For Republicans, just 10% say that goal is very important for them. 54% of Democrats do. But among independents, they're in the middle. 24% still say that's a very important goal for them. So in the face of a general consensus that we're not going to get there, Democrats shouldn't say exaggerate, but place high importance on the issue. Republicans put low importance on the issue, but independents are somewhere in between.
Another issue is the condition of the state's finances. You've seen some of the governor's ads. He's talked about erasing the deficit that was present when he took office. Of course, we also saw last week the Legislative Fiscal Bureau projection that we could be facing another deficit of $1.8 billion deficit. So we've been asking people how they feel about the shape of the state budget. Is it better today than it was 2 years ago?
Right. When we first asked about this was in January of this year in a survey that happened to be timed at the same time that the news about a budget surplus had come out just as the governor gave the state of the state and proposed more tax cuts. At that point, 49% said the budget was in better shape than a few years ago. Just 20% said it was in worse shape. In August, it was still 45 better and 22 worse, and a little bit, but not much. We had begun to see some questions about revenue at this point. And now, in the wake of a structural deficit estimate, better's at 41, worse is at 27. This is surely an important issue normatively, but also as a campaign issue is beginning to be emphasized. We'll watch this carefully to see whether there's any continuing shift. Still, by not quite a 2-to-1 advantage, better is greater than worse, but you do see some movement beginning to occur on this.
It's time to revisit the old right direction, wrong track question. We've been asking this in just about everything for some time, I guess. And really, not much difference, Charles.
We were right then, we're right now. Hadn't been any change at all since August. 54% right direction, 42% wrong track, exactly the same as where it was.
Any change in the governor's job approval from August to September?
Not very much, but just a little bit. In August, it was 47-47, approved, disapproved. And now in September, it's 49-46. So a little bit of movement in the governor's direction, but up 2 and down 1. We've been seeing this number kind of bounce around in this range. We have yet to see several polls in a row establish a trend over time.
The favorable, unfavorable question, your opinion of the candidates. We asked this about Mary Burke. Initially, Charles, when we were asking about Mary Burke, very few people really knew about her. It was amazing how long that trend lasted, but now more people are recognizing her. Has that changed the favorable or unfavorable numbers?
And this is another indicator. If the jobs question is one, the budget question is another, these favorability items are really important because for a newcomer like Burke, as more and more people get to know her, does her net favorable start to move in her direction, in which case she's winning the argument? Does it move in unfavorable, in which case the Walker campaign is winning the argument? So how have those changed? In August, you should see she was a net +1 favorable, with 35% saying they hadn't heard. In January, it was 70% that hadn't heard, so half of where it had been. And in September, it's still a net favorable of 1. And the haven't heard has fallen to 29, down 6 points. So both favorables and unfavorables have moved up by the same amount, producing no change in the net at all. Certainly a strong indication that the two campaigns are indeed waging essentially balanced campaigns, neither being more convincing than the other at this point. But with the trend of people beginning to learn who Mary Burke is and form opinions about her continuing.
Any change in the governor's favorable numbers?
A little bit. Favorable, unfavorable was 48-48. It's now 49-45. So a little improvement in his net favorables. And of course, practically everybody has an opinion about the governor.
Our empathy question again, we asked whether the candidate, either Mary Burke or Scott Walker, cares about people like me. And that's an important question. Many campaigns look to that as a key question.
Certainly a key question in the 2012 Senate race, where it evolved and shifted quite a bit over the course of the campaign. Sorry. There we go. So in August, Burke 43-35 and a sizable don't know. Now that don't know is down. Cares is up a little bit. Does not care is down 1 point. So a little bit of net favorable shift, net improvement in her standing on this. For Governor Walker, he's been a little underwater on this throughout the year. In August, it was 45-50. That has narrowed a little bit to 47-50 now. So a little bit of movement on that. but not a whole lot. And again, almost everyone has an opinion on this one.
We ask people if either one of these candidates is someone who can get things done, who gets things done. And we ask if Mary Burke first and then the governor.
So Burke actually does fairly well on this in August. 43 gets things done, 32 not, but again, 24 don't know. This month, it's 44-35 and down to 20 don't know. So still a lot of uncertainty about her, but a net favorable on this. For Governor Walker, this has been his strong suit. Many people might say, whether you agree with him or not, he certainly has accomplished his goals. So 68% in August said that, just 28% said he does not describe him. It's fallen off just a little bit. To 64 gets done, 31 does not. Just point to this as an example of what I was saying earlier about the party idea shift. Despite the shift in partisanship, here you see something that's moving in the opposite direction. So it's just an example of why parties not be complete determinant of these things.
One of the things you hear from a lot of voters is, I'd like to know more about what they would do if they were elected. And so we asked a question to that effect.
Do you think each candidate has been clear enough so you know what you get if you elected them or if they were elected? With Burke, more people are unsure about that than sure. 42% say yes, they think she's been clear enough. But 48% say no, she's not, and 10% say they don't know. For Governor Walker, it's the opposite, and fairly strong opinion. 57% saying yes, they're pretty clear about what Governor Walker would do in his second term. But 39% say no, not so much, and again, just a little bit, 4% aren't sure.
Let's go back to the AG's race for just a moment and look at some of the favorable and unfavorable numbers for both Susan Happ and Brad Schimel.
Right. So this is the towering can over there.
And then that's what
this is
after the primary.
This is after the primary, and the 73 plus the 9 is the 82% that couldn't give an opinion about Happ. When we move to September, that hasn't changed a lot. It's now 68 plus 5, so it's down to 73, unable to give a rating. But what has bumped up is the unfavorable, not the favorable. Let me back up so you can see it. So in August, Happ was 12 favorable, 7 unfavorable. And in September, it's still 12 favorable, but it's up to 14 unfavorable. So almost all of the shift from don't know about her to having an opinion has netted out to be unfavorable opinion developing, so that now those two are roughly balanced. Net -2, and still a huge percentage of the electorate that don't know enough. For Brad Schimel, even more had not heard about him. That's not too confusing, given no primary and everything. But an 8 to 5, favorable, unfavorable. There's been very little change in awareness of him. It was 87 didn't know him a month ago. It's still 86 that don't know him now. So there really hadn't been any movement in forming opinions about him. His favorable is still at the 8. Whoa, where'd it go? There we go, August. Favorable is 8, unfavorable was at 5, went up to 6. In other words, no change on that. So most of the action in the AG's race has come in opinion formation about Susan Happ, but
Yes, one of the bust open. I talked to Brad Schimel about this, and he said, I have been on the campaign trail every day, and 76% of the people don't know who I am, and they don't know anything about me. It's frustrating for a candidate standpoint.
it's enough to make you buy television advertising.
But our next poll result won't necessarily encourage them that things will change in the future, because we asked a question about J.B. Van Hollen, the current Attorney General, who's been in office for 8 years. He's wrapping up his term. He's not going to run for re-election. We asked whether people knew much about J.B. Van Hollen.
And he has been a little bit in the news
Yes,
lately
a couple of
as well.
times,
You know,
yeah.
it's not like he's just been disappearing lately. Also, before I show you the number, let me just put it in that context of Mary Burke entered the race with 70% not recognizing her. You see the two AG candidates entered above 80% not recognizing. So what does 8 years in office do for you? 51%, half still don't know who you are. Okay? A net favorable by 4 points, but I think the clear message here is that even a very important statewide office holder, even one who's frequently in the news, doesn't necessarily develop an image among voters, at least outside of the concerted efforts that go on during campaigns.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Charles, very important office in the state. And we wanted to ask a question about how people view the role of the Attorney General, because this campaign in many respects will have one of the candidates, Brad Schimmel, who says, my job is to defend the state's laws. That's what I should do. If there's a reasonable argument being made, that's what I do. As Susan Aptis said, there's certain laws I'm not going to defend. I don't agree with them. I don't think they're going to pass constitutional muster in the end. We try to get at that. How do people want their Attorney General to behave when that person's in office?
Yeah, we didn't want to ask it about a specific issue because then it becomes tied up in that particular issue. So the way we framed it was, do you think the state's Attorney General should appeal a decision by a federal court that strikes down state laws or state constitutional provisions? Or should the Attorney General use their judgment based on how likely they are to prevail in the ultimate decision? So it's sort of, pretty much expected to go there versus more judgment. Voters actually give judgment quite a bit of credit here. 54% say the Attorney General should use their judgment. 31% say they should appeal.
Let's look at an issue that we've polled on from time to time. This is the legalization of marijuana, which is, in some parts of the country, a big story. We don't seem to be as far along as some other states in this issue.
No, that's right. There's been some talk about legislation on this in the state. It's not at the stage that, again, some states, Colorado most prominently recently, has been. In September, 46% said it should be legal, 51% say it should not. The way we frame this question is, do you think the use of marijuana should be legal or not? So we're not asking about medical marijuana or other ways that might make it a little more palatable. We're going the whole hog for legalization. This is roughly where it was when we last asked about it in the spring. In the spring, not legal was 52, legal was 42, so a little bit of movement, but not really distinguishable. We had asked it of a half sample of just 400 people back in the fall in October, and in that smaller sample, legalization was slightly more popular than keeping it illegal. I think now with 2 full 800-person samples under our belt, we're have pretty good basis to say this is a close issue, but maybe legalization trailing by a few percentage points behind keeping it illegal.
The state's photo ID law is back in the news. You're familiar with the Federal Appeals Court panel ruling on Friday, which says the state can reinstate the photo ID requirement for the November election, and currently is the plan. There could be other legal challenges to that. That is the plan at this moment. We poll on photo ID on many occasions, Charles. What do we see right now?
Right. More of the same. 63% in August supported photo ID. In September, it's 61%. 61 to 35 in the September data. That's very close to where it's been since we first asked about it in 2012. We've seen actually very little change in this. This is a variable that doesn't jump around. It doesn't drop down into the mid-50s. It doesn't jump up into the 70s. It stays close to 60%. I think 63 overall average approval of it. So pretty strong support for it. There are some party differences, not too surprising ones. 87% of Republicans back photo ID. 62% of Democrats oppose it, but 61% of independents favor it. So partisan differences here that are quite strong, but overall pretty broad support, at least in principle. Again, our question simply says, do you think you should be required to have a government-issued photo ID in order to vote? We have not plumbed the question about what the complications might come from that. And we were in the field already on Thursday. We've done over 300 interviews. I'm getting really tired of court decisions coming down on Friday. So I'll take Fridays off just for the sake of the poll. But in any case, there was no change in opinion about this over the Thursday to Friday to Saturday to Sunday sample. So I don't see any evidence that the court's decision had any impact on these numbers.
We asked a couple questions about the school voucher program. This is a sort of second nature to many people in Milwaukee and even in Racine in the last couple of years. But as you know, the voucher program was expanded statewide in the last year. The talk now is whether or not to lift the enrollment cap on the number of kids in the voucher program statewide. How do people feel about this issue?
Divided, but pretty stable in the divisions. We've been seeing this over past surveys as well, though this time we asked the question a little differently, so they're not really comparable exactly to others. So the options we offered were lift the enrollment cap for vouchers statewide, 18% would go there. Increase the limit from the current 1,000 students, but to some other limit, which we didn't specify. 21% went for that. Keep the current limit of 1,000, 19%, end it statewide, and we're talking only about the statewide expansion, not talking about Milwaukee, and we're seeing parts of it. So this is only the expanded voucher program we're talking about. So what you see is the modal category. I love working in those statistics terms here. The single biggest category is ended. But if you put no limit and larger limit together, you get almost the same thing. 39% that would see some expansion to 38% that would do away with it altogether. Which if you think in terms of swing voters, means these 19% in here maybe could tip the balance one direction or another depending on the issue. The governor's proposed expanding or doing away with the limits since this is a campaign issue, though, to my knowledge, at least has not been at the center of recent advertising debates anyway.
And I think the Burke campaign has said we want to do away with the statewide expansion, just
Yes.
keep Milwaukee in the city. So it's a point of
Exactly.
differentiation.
Exactly. It is a point where the candidates are taking different positions. But you can see why both campaigns could look at these numbers and kind of see some things that work to their advantage or to the other guy's advantage. We did ask a follow-up question that said, what if the money to pay for the vouchers comes out of state aid to the local school, public school district? It makes almost no difference. There's a little decrease here and here, and a little upturn here, and the end statewide doesn't change at all. I think that's important because often when you remind people in a question that there might be some cost to a policy, you see a shift in opinion. Here, there's very little change, which says to me that voters have had enough time to think about the trade-offs between vouchers and public schools, and their opinions are not that easily shifted just by being reminded that this could be moving from one budget to a different budget.
Charles, in August, we asked people about Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, choose your term, depending on your politics. How are people feeling about that today, and how does it look compared to August?
Yeah, we refer to it as the recent federal health care reform law. So we straddle it and don't give it a name, which more unfavorable than not. This has been the case nationally since the law passed, even before it passed. Here in Wisconsin, it's been this way. In August 53-36, it's just a little less unfavorable in this new sample, a little more favorable, but still on balance, upside down as it has been for a long time.
So what do people want done with it? They want it repealed, they want it replaced, do they want to improve it, keep it, what do they want
And
to do?
here's the really surprising result that we saw in the spring as well. Most people would either keep it or keep it and modify it to improve it. 60% in those two categories together. 18% would repeal it and replace it with a Republican alternative. And 18% would repeal it altogether and not replace it. So about 37% over here on some kind of repeal or repeal and replace, and about 60% on keep it or keep and improve it. And this is a paradox, but we've seen it now in several polls. We see it in some national polls that ask similar questions. It's one thing to not like the law or have an unfavorable view on it. It's another to say what you would actually do about it. And when it comes to that, granted, how you're going to improve it might be a little hard to specify for everyone.
An offshoot of this, and it takes us to a different question, is whether or not people in the state feel that Wisconsin should accept federal dollars to expand the Medicaid program, Wisconsin Badger Care. This has become a campaign issue. Mary Burke says we should have taken the money. The governor says, I don't think the federal government is going to be good for the money in a few years, so we're not going to take it to do things our own way. We've been pulling on this both in August and September. We'll be fine.
Yep. So in August, 29% said we should reject the federal money, 58% said we should take it. Now in September, it's 29 reject and 61 accept. A little shift in that direction of accepting. This again is coming on top of legislative fiscal bureau reports on the fiscal consequences of accepting or rejecting the money, and on top of the current budget issue, and predates estimates of the healthcare budget going forward into the next biennium, which came out this week. So as part of the combination of a disliked healthcare reform, but with fiscal implications as well as coverage implications, quite a striking result, I think. And one that, again, is held up pretty solidly. The 61 has jumped around a little bit, but it's tended to be in the high 50s or low 60s whenever we've asked it.
Well, one of the big challenges facing the state in the years ahead is how do we pay for our transportation needs? And you and I talked about this, Charles. There's not been a lot of discussion about that in this campaign. It's a tough issue for political candidates, and we try to get at how the people feel about this issue.
Yeah, this is one of those things that matters a lot for the budget makers and the transportation users as well as builders. But it's been very tough, and it's been tough, as I think an article this week noted, to get either of the candidates for governor to really directly engage on the question of, well, what are you going to do about roads? So we asked the question, and I tried to give people some fairly unpalatable options. We've asked in the past a different set of questions. This time I wanted to make you choose between them. So you can raise taxes, 30% would go for that. You can continue to borrow money. We borrowed nearly $1 billion in the last biennium for road construction. Only 5% are willing to do that. We could build less and have less money for maintenance. Again, I wanted to make it painful, so I didn't say delay, which we had asked before, but we just have to go along with less roads. 13%. Or we can take the money from other budgets. 42% would go there. Unfortunately, taking from other budgets was the easy out because I didn't say what other budgets you were going to take it from. Take it from prisons, take it from healthcare, take it from education. When we're talking about the top 4 or 5 programs, those are the only programs that have money large enough to really seriously affect the shortfall in transportation funds at this point. So this will not solve any problems, but it will certainly give lobbyists an opportunity to engage in discussions of whose budget should be moved into the transportation.
And what's interesting about that last number, depending on what happens in a statewide referendum, there's a question on the ballot in November. People will be voting on this, and it's basically going to say we can no longer use transportation fund money for other projects. I mean, there's going to be some really interesting decisions here in the next year or so on this matter.
And this is an area that's been delayed, but it's been delayed at the federal level as well. You'll remember that there was a near bankruptcy or running out of money anyway in the federal highway fund. That's been kicked down the road effectively for a few months. But that problem's not going away either. So we're not alone as a state with this issue. I think we are also not at all alone in that we all want to have roads that we can go down on without too many potholes. But how we're willing to pay for that is real tough.
I was in Kenosha last night, lots of questions about the Kenosha casino. What's going to happen? Will the governor approve the new casino? We've been asking about this question. Still some popular support for this.
Yes, there is, and not a lot of movement. In August, 49% supported, 35% would reject the casino. In September, it's 50-39, so virtually no movement. This is one truly bipartisan issue. When you break it out by party, opinion about this issue doesn't vary more than a couple of percentage points across party categories, with more support than opposition among Dems, among reps, and among independents. So it's rare to find a political issue that's as nonpartisan as this one is, but it's also not overwhelmingly divided one way or another. There's more support in southeastern Wisconsin than in the rest of the state, but it's fairly evenly divided. And this has been pretty stable for a number of months.
We have been asking about the John Doe investigation since 2012. It seems to have a new twist and turn every so often, so we continue to ask about it periodically.
And again, documents coming out on Friday afternoons. So, and in fact, in our last field period, new documents came out on the Friday that we were in the field. So we had not asked about the doe in that particular sample, so we did this time. Again, nothing has changed on this. People know about it, 3/4 knew, 1/4 said they haven't really heard about it. But that's been very stable for months and months and months. We asked then for those people who have heard, is this just more politics or is it something really serious? In July, 54-42. In September, July was the last time we asked, sorry. In September, July, 54-42, politics over serious. In September, politics is up to 59, serious is down to 37. And so the releases, the emails from the beginning of the summer do not show any evidence of having seriously, no pun intended, shifted the weight to the serious side on this question. Instead, if anything, just more politics has grown modestly over that time.
So we've actually gotten through all the slides. I give you a chance to say a final thought here on your takeaway from this survey, Charles.
I think the key points I would like to push on are how we watch this race develop from now till November. There's still quite a few people who haven't developed opinions about Mary Burke. There are still lots and lots and lots of people that don't know the Attorney General candidate. So watching how those two evolve over time is awfully important. But I think the issues that we've stressed here are the issues out of the campaign. The jobs issue, the budget issue, what to do about Medicaid money, what to do about schools. Less than the campaign issue, the transportation issue. But the things to, I think, pay a lot of attention to going forward are awareness and how does net favorability change as that shifts, and on these key issues of jobs and the budget, paying attention and following those as we go. It's a dynamic process. I guess the last thing I would say is, given the shift we saw in enthusiasm between August and September, the next poll will help us understand, was that just a fluke? Was it a real shift in momentum? There are two things that drive elections. One is how many people prefer each candidate, and the other is who shows up to vote. And so you change election outcomes in both ways. Enthusiasm, commitment to voting is one. Preference between the candidates is the other. So we really have two moving parts here between now and Election Day. And at least to judge from 2012, the enthusiasm element can have more of a dynamic over time than the preference between the two candidates, with issues shifting at the margins, with images of the candidates shifting at the margins. So there are other working parts, but who do you prefer, and how sure are you to actually get out and vote?
And Charles, I know you want to make it clear that really from this point forward, we're going to be looking really closely at those likely voters from here on out.
Yes.
You know, we've been doing both the registered and likely, but we're now at that point.
Thank you for reminding me about that. I've been saying since the spring that likely voters aren't as sure about whether they will or won't vote until you get to around Labor Day or a little bit after. But the whole world wants to know what likely voters look like. So I slightly reluctantly started producing likely voter estimates for a while now. But the point, and I said this before, as we get closer and closer to the election, it makes more sense to pay more attention, put more weight on the likely voters than it does to look at the registered voters. And there's plenty of research to show that that gets to be a better and better predictor of the vote as you get closer and closer to Election Day, but it improves throughout the fall. We will, as always, continue to report both of these sets of numbers, and people are free to pay attention to which they like and choose the one that suits their conclusions. But you know, it's all on the website. You can download both sets and have as much fun as you want.
Well, we have time for a few questions. Yeah, we'll try and grab a couple. Start there. Yes.
Obviously not in this poll, but from past polls or just your infinite knowledge, do you happen to know like a feeling thermometer about drug testing for financial?
It's not a question we've ever asked, and it may well have been asked on national polls, but I'm not aware of one at this point. Certainly an issue, though, that now is live in the campaign that might come up.
Yes, sir.
Have you asked likely voters whether they have the appropriate ID, and if did you adjust, and if not, will you start doing so and adjusting?
Again, Friday's decision changed the plans on that. We will certainly think about ways that we can get at that question. It's not trivially easy in the sense that we're talking about people who are already registered to vote, because ours is a sample of registered voters. So that's a complication for those who might register but might not. It's also a complication for, do you know if your ID actually qualifies or not? So there's plenty of room to explore this coming up.
How many additional polls will you do between now and election day?
More than one, less than 10. Stay tuned.
This is a question on the budget. I read about the Walker budget deficit in the Milwaukee Journal. It was my understanding that state law says there can't be a deficit, that you have to balance the budget. Nor was I aware that there was an impending deficit. What is that all about?
It's a very complicated issue, as I know you know, and it's problematic for how we ask about it in a campaign, because the two campaigns, the two parties, are sharply contesting this question about whether we do or don't face a deficit next year, right? And so from a pollster's point of view, it doesn't make much sense to ask voters about the technicality of is there or isn't there per se, but to ask them their perceptions filtered by the messages they're getting by the campaigns. So we'll be thinking about that. You know, one nice thing about the question we do ask, do you think the budget's in better shape or not, is it's a simple question. We've been asking it for a long time, so we have a long, well-established trend on it. And so even though it doesn't directly raise the question of the difference between a structural and an actual or constitutional prohibition against a deficit, voters can still respond to it in the way that they're getting the impressions from the campaign. So that's my
Is
approach.
it your impression that there is an intended deficit?
You can't get me to answer that question.
Go right behind.
Professor, I counted at least 35 questions in your poll. Do you tell people that you contact that you have 35 questions to ask them, and do they have 10 or 15 minutes, and does that in itself have any impact on the result?
Actually, surprisingly, almost none. Our questionnaire runs about 16 minutes in a bad month, which frankly this one is. We ran 17 minutes, so it's kind of a long questionnaire. Almost no one breaks off an interview once they've started it. The biggest problem, not just for us, but for all pollsters, is getting someone to pick up the telephone in the first place. You know, I don't know that number, I'm not picking it up, right? Or I don't ever answer my number, my phone calls. I let them all go to voicemail. Let God sort them out later. So there's, when we get someone to pick up the phone, or let me put it differently, when someone picks up the phone, here in Wisconsin, we got over a 50% response rate at that point. But our overall response rate is under 10%, the same as all national polls are, because of the call screening aspect of it. The good news is Democrats and Republicans are equally likely to screen their calls, so there's not ultimately a partisan bias because of that low response rate. But it is a challenge for the industry in general. I think the good news is what I said about when someone picks up the phone, people are more, as often as not, let's say 50-50, cooperative, they're happy to do the interview, and they almost never break it off later.
Time for one more question.
Yes. Yesterday, I got a poll from the Walker campaign, and it was entirely the same questions you're asking, but fewer of them. Is there something they get out of it that they couldn't get out of their own poll? Why
Sure.
would they ask the same questions?
Yeah, well, hey, I don't know. I'd love to know. Pollsters are nothing if not interested in what other people are doing. And I won't play too much campaign strategist, but a lot of campaign calls sample from registered voter lists, so they know who they're calling. Whereas in our sampling, we dial the numbers completely at random, so we don't know anything about someone until they pick up the phone. But the campaigns often do, and indeed, they have all kinds of data that's available, and the Democrats are doing this too. In fact, the Obama campaign kind of pioneered this. So you have an awful lot of data about your phone number and you before you even pick up the phone. So that means you can leverage all that additional data on this set of questions that you're being asked. And that's just a very general answer. I have no idea at all what Walker folks, or for that matter, the Burke folks are doing specifically.
Do you have about the amount of money that's being spent by parties and the effect of ads at this point?
Sure. We don't have direct evidence about that. Craig Gilbert did a piece in the Journal Sentinel this week on the aggregate spending by television market around the state. So it's possible to look at that, but that's getting off in the world of other kinds of data. We do the survey data and leave it to others to look at the campaign finance material itself. I'd say that in general, there's a deep division between campaign practitioners who believe that an ad can move the vote 10 points overnight, and political scientists who tried to study this and find at best it takes 1,000 ads to move the vote 2 percentage points. So there's a deep divide between the scholarly literature on the impact of ads, which finds a statistically significant effect, but it's modest and it takes a lot of ads to have that effect, versus the people that make and sell the ads that are absolutely convinced they can dramatically reshape a campaign almost instantly. And whenever we have joint conferences, it gets ugly fast. So I can't answer the which is true.
We're going to wrap things up right there. I want to thank all of you for your time and your attention today. Thank Dr. Franklin for his observations again. And a reminder, we have another in our On the Issue series tomorrow in the appellate courtroom downstairs. Howard Fuller, the former Milwaukee Public Schools superintendent, and current Marquette University professor, will be talking about his new book, which is called No Struggle, No Progress. It's a pretty interesting book. I just finished it myself. So we expect a full house tomorrow, but we'll try and squeeze you in to make it. So thanks again for your time. See you next time.